a little bit different in the situation we have here with Solomon, in that he took the wife as opposed to the opposite of that typically happening. All right. And now as we get into after he kind of does that the first part, and we look back at what Chuck read, that the people that he was going to build his buildings. He was going to build his own house, the house of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. And this was not a small undertaking, was it? We're going to get into more details next week, but just to hit the highlights, he chose 70,000 people to bear the burdens, 80,000 people to quarry stone out of the quarries, and 3,600 supervisors. I mean, as you all know, and Ronnie's got me started on it, we were doing a little house edition. I think I'm the only person doing most of it. And I tell you, that's a job, but it's just a little small building. I couldn't imagine if I had 80,000 people running around. I mean, it's like, more people than the city of Alabaster. And, that's just one part of it. And 70,000, that's 150,000 people right there. There's obviously a lot of work to be done, but that shows the mass and the size of it, the scope of this project. With that much help, obviously you can get a lot more done. And like I said, we'll get into more details of that next week. But yeah, I definitely had a lot of help. So, and he oversaw the main part of that as well. He oversaw the building of his own house, the house of the Lord, and the wall around Jerusalem. And all of these building projects are important. And Solomon's palace reminds us of the wealth that he possessed. And we'll get into that, like I say, again next week a little bit more. But it states in here, Solomon's temple is arguably his greatest accomplishment from 2 Samuel 7:13. It denotes his devotion to God, at least for a time, as we already alluded to. And then the wall that Solomon built around Jerusalem reflects the king's intent to protect the capital of Israel from its enemies. So you can see that he's done a lot really to kind of set and establish everything, from taking care of the enemies from within, and then trying to make treaties with people from without on the outside, and then building the wall to keep even other people out. So he's doing a lot to try to protect and to ensure the kingdom. But then we see where some of the issues arise. They didn't have a temple, which is where they were commanded to go and worship. So the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. I'd like to read, going back to Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 2 through 7. If you want to turn there, Deuteronomy chapter 12. And it mentions just a couple of verses, but we want to read 2 through 7. And this talks about the high places where they worship their false gods. And in Deuteronomy it says, "You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their gods and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, but you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes and to put his name and to make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes, and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, in all that you undertake, in which the Lord your God has blessed you." So we already see that they were to destroy all those places, but it's from what we understand, they did not, did they? And they still continue to go worship there in those high places where the pagan gods were worshipped. Why is that? They didn't have a temple, did they? And I think that's one of the things that, with David, and we're going to turn to that passage in 1 Chronicles, intended to do that, but was not able to. But then carried on with Solomon. So let's go to 1 Chronicles 28. And we'll also read verses 2 through 7 in that one. 1 Chronicles 28, verses 2 through 7. "Then King David rose to his feet and said, 'Hear me, my brothers and my people. I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and of the footstool of our God. And I made preparations for building. But God said to me, you may not build a house for my name, for you are a man of war and have shed blood.'" Again, that's a reference to, even though I kind of mentioned earlier, he didn't take care of the threats from within as much, He was a warrior as far as shedding blood. Yet the Lord God of Israel chose me from all my father's house to be king over Israel forever. For he chose Judah his leader, and in the house of Judah, my father's house, and among my father's sons, he took pleasure in me to make me king over all Israel. And of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen Solomon, my son, to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, It is Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. I will establish his kingdom forever, if he continues strong in keeping my commandments and my rules as he is today. So you kind of see that David had intended to build this temple, but God told him that, no, you're not the one that's going to do it, but in your seed, your son, Solomon, he's the one that's going to build it. So it was already kind of the handwriting on the wall, so to speak, that, Solomon was going to be building the temple. And, when he went after it full force, didn't he? With that many men that, he had recruited to help build it. And then, again, I'm referencing to next week, we're going to go in more details of that. But, a grand temple, I'm sure his house was nothing to be ashamed of either. And then the wall. So, some major building projects. So again, we see that, they were to destroy those places, yet that's where they worship. And then the temple would eventually be where, where they would go to worship. But until that was completed, Solomon sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. And that's going to kind of bring us to our next section of verses 4 through 15. But as we transition to that, are there any questions, thoughts, comments?
It's as you pointed out, he didn't have a temple to go to, he didn't have a tabernacle yet. That's long gone. And so, he had to sacrifice somewhere. Maybe anywhere but there would have been a better choice.
Right.
And yet, this paragraph from, chapter 3, verses 3 through 5, would indicate that God was not displeased with Solomon for what he was doing.
Right.
He expresses that Solomon loved the Lord, and God then talked to him, directed to him.
Right.
He indicated pleasure, I would say, with Solomon at that point. So it must be that the high places where they were, historically, as you were pointing out from your other readings, they had all these images and so on there, presumably, these awful gods that they were worshiping at the high places. No doubt they did not have that at this time.
Right, that's why they could have gone in and destroyed a lot of it, but then kind of left the main places or whatever. But yeah, exactly, destroying the idolatry, the false gods, the images, things such as that. Exactly.
Right. We have been I remember when we were in Israel, there is at Dan, in the far north of Israel, there's a high place that's still there. It was there in the New Testament time. But it is literally built up with stones and so on. It's like a mound, big high mound with the steps going up and all that. So some of these others are probably somewhat similar.
Right. And it made me think too, so many times people worship false gods or even trying to worship the true God on a high place. Think about the Tower of Babel. We're going to build this tower all the way up to the heavens, and then God, obviously said, no, we're going to disperse this, the language barriers, everything else that came along with that. But it was a matter of getting higher, getting closer to God, whether it's the real God or false gods, either one. So obviously the pagans had all these false gods and things they worship on these high places. So, and as we're going to see in the next section, as Jim alluded to, the fact that he sacrificed, 1,000 sacrifices there at the altar, and that God was pleased, he appeared to him in the dream. So let's go ahead and read that. It's a longer passage, but verses 4 through 15, if somebody would read that, please. Okay.
And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, because that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what you wish me to give you." Then Solomon said, "You have shown great faithfulness to your servant David, my father, according as he walked before you in truth, righteousness, and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have reserved for him this great faithfulness, that you have given him a son to sit on the throne as it is this day. And now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father, and yet I am like a little boy
Yes, please.
Then Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered burnt offerings, and made peace offerings, and held a feast for all his servants.
Thank you, Jim.
Isn't that an amazing exchange?
Absolutely, and that's what I was going to refer to is like, it's easy for us, I think, to look back, and we have the story to read in the Bible that talks about what he asked for, and I think it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, I'd do the same thing. If it was up to me, absolutely. And I'm going to kind of allude to the same type thing in the next section as we do as well. But it's one thing, they say hindsight's 20/20, right? If you had not read this story and you were asked, what do you want? You've got a genie in the bottle, whatever it might be, and you get to have a wish. Is that what you would wish for? I think a lot of us would think about a lot of other things besides that wisdom, besides the ability to discern, saying that I am weak, I don't know how to lead this many people, I'm not sure what to do, I wish you'd give me the wisdom to discern, to do justice. And, I think so many times, whether it's materialism, whether it's, whatever else gets in our way, and, like I say, looking back, we say, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. But if you had not read the story, would you have, that same desire? And I think the answer for most of us, we know. There's probably other things that we'd asked for before that. But then again, do you look at the total wisdom and everything else in the whole plan, what more could you have asked for? And obviously God was very pleased with that. And, told him, as Jim read, you didn't ask for those things, but I'm going to give it to you anyways because of what you did ask for. And I think it's a good lesson for us that, to not be selfish, to not be trying to, go after worldly gain so much of what sometimes we do, almost like running the rat race of life, or so to say, and trying to get more and more possessions or whatever might happen. I'm out of juice right now. All right, we're back on again. I only had like one bar and a half, or maybe two, so I didn't know if I was going to make it through or not. But as we read on page 89, that as far as the high places, he had gone there to worship, and 1,000 offerings on that table on the altar. So that was a lot of dedication. We don't know how many years that was, but we know there was a lot of times that he went and made multiple sacrifices. And that did please the Lord that he was making those sacrifices. And then that's when he appeared to Solomon by the dream at night, and asked the question, "What shall I give you?" And as they stated in here, that was the opportunity of a lifetime. That was his chance to win the lottery. To be set for life or whatever else. And think about all those things that he could have asked for that he didn't. And like I said, that's just hard for us to fathom, I believe. But, he responded by praising the Lord for showing the mercy and kindness to his dad. He acknowledged that God was the reason that he, David's son, was sitting on the throne. But he admitted that he was unprepared to lead God's people. And of all the things he could have requested, he asked God for wisdom sufficient to lead Israel. And obviously that's what, pleased God, and the fact that he asked for that with that humble request. And then, like I say, he granted that. And I think it's interesting that he said, the wisdom that would be like no other. Wealth and riches that would be like no other. Nobody before, nobody after. And as we read, that is definitely the case. And also kind of went forward a little bit. The Queen of Sheba, had heard at some point of Solomon's wisdom, and she came to test his wisdom and add a bunch of questions to see if he was really as wise as what she had heard. And said that he answered every one of her questions without any hesitation, just very, right off the spot. So she realized that this wisdom is not even half of what he actually has, and then brought other riches to him on that. So it's kind of crazy that, he had all this wealth and everything else, but then other people came, heard about his wisdom, and gave him more stuff. I mean, it just kind of multiplied everything. But, and that's what we'll get into the next section of, the first time that we see this, this wisdom as it was portrayed. So a part of it too, though, is that, there should be none other like you and all the kings of your days, with the little caveat, as long as Solomon served the Lord, he would enjoy God's blessing. And you can see that later on in life, as we alluded to, that he did stray and, had issues because of that. But once he arrived, he stood before the ark of the Lord, offered up burnt sacrifice, this is after the dream, the burnt offerings, and offered up peace offerings, and made a feast for all of his servant. And then he would soon begin building the place where all Israel would come to worship God. Are there any thoughts or comments as we talk about that section? Yes?
The cross-reference that the lesson gives tells us in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 3, tells us why he went to Gibeon. That was because the tent of meeting was there, the tabernacle was still there.
Right.
The ark was back in Jerusalem at that time, because David had brought it back earlier.
And I'll just go ahead and read that verse, 2 Chronicles 1, verse 3. And Solomon and all the assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon, for the tent of meeting of God, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, had made in the wilderness, was there. And then, as she mentioned too, but David had brought up the ark of the God from Kiriath Jearim to the place that David had prepared for it, for he had pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. So, we kind of see there again, and thank you for that, the reason he was going there. And obviously that was, I would say that's his place of choice as far as where he went to, the high place. To make 1,000 sacrifices there, then, he's obviously been there multiple times. And, kind of his, kind of a home base, so to speak, before the temple was built. All right, any other thoughts? Yes. Right. Well, and I kind of thought the same thing in a way because, when God said, don't go to these high places and worship, yet he was going there, but he was also pleased. And like you mentioned, the sacrifices, but obviously he made sacrifices that, were pleasing to God, or he wouldn't have. So I really don't know the answer to that. Jim?
Well, just a thought, Tom, and that sort of went through my mind too a while ago about it. But, when it speaks of Solomon offering sacrifices, I mean, just to take a parallel, it speaks of Solomon building the temple. But Solomon didn't build the temple with his own hands, right? And we could as well interpret it to mean that Solomon had sacrifices offered rather than.
So instead of him doing it himself, it was kind of like that alluded to, right. And that could be the case that he took the priest up and they made the sacrifices kind of in his name.
You're building we could be right to say you're building in addition to your house. But Ronnie did part of it. And Ronnie didn't do it himself either, right, Ronnie?
Nope. I didn't see him lift a hand or shovel or anything. I've been pouring concrete now. I'm waiting on him to show up and help me pour that concrete. He's not even doing that underneath the patio, so I'm not sure. But right, and that could very well be the case that, obviously there was, he had a lot of people that were followers and everything as him being the king, and that could be the case that, he made the sacrifices. He may not have physically made those sacrifices himself, but he had those sacrifices made, and that could definitely be part of it.
One other thing I think should be put into the discussion is Samuel had, I believe it was Samuel, that told Saul to wait, I will be there. So he's had instructions, specific instructions, and he violated those. He didn't wait.
Yeah.
We're not told 100% of the things that took place here around Solomon. We could.
Right, absolutely. And it's like, we have what we have, and then, a lot of it you have to make some, either educated guesses or things on it, to try to find the details. Right? Any other comments? I appreciate all the comments and questions and everything. Okay, so the third section we got is Solomon the Wise, and this is, the first time, and I've already kind of alluded to it. Put yourself in this situation. As we read this last section, again, it's real easy to see the solution once Solomon presented it. But if we had not read that before, put yourself in the same situation. Think about, when these two harlots come and talk about their kid, one of them's kid dying and whose fault it was and whose kid was whose and all that. Put yourself in that situation if you've not read the story before and think if that's the way you would have handled it or not. So, as we read that, I'd like to get somebody to read verses 16 through 28. And like I said, just try to put yourself in that situation. First time you have this story brought to you, this trial, and see if you would think you would have answered the same way. So 16 through 28. Thank you, Chad. So, like I say, put yourself in that situation. Now, you got a situation here where there are no witnesses. It's just one word or the other word. You got two people there. And the wisdom of that decision to bring the true truth out. The true mother of the child obviously would not want anything. She would rather lose that child to the other mother than to have her child killed. And like I say, we look at it today and think, oh, that's an easy decision. We can make that decision. We could easily do that today. But if you'd never had a decision like that made, wouldn't that be just really wow? It's like I said, we look at it, it's a no-brainer. But back then, it's like, I would have never thought about that. What would make somebody think, okay, we'll just cut the child in half and each of y'all can have a half? Obviously that's not going to be good for the child, but that brought out the truth. And that wisdom, that judgment right there is, I think, what we're looking at, just so much more than what we have today. Right now it's always, he said, she said. It's your word against somebody else's word. And, what do you want in the court system? You want witnesses. But even with witnesses, how many times do you have witnesses that see the same thing but have different stories? It happens all the time. Whether your perspectives are a little different or whether you're, skewed one way or the other for, reasons or whatever else. In this case, we didn't have a witness at all. You just had the two mothers. And the decision to say, all right, we're just going to chop the child in half, and y'all can each have a half. It can be settled. To me, that is really just, overwhelming as far as that goes. Now, as we look in our lesson on page 90, there's always kind of a question I always have about, why was this said or whatever. But one of the details is that the two women were both described as harlots. And it says, this detail is likely provided to cast doubt on their morality and thus amplify Solomon's wise decision. Why do you think that makes a difference that they're both harlots? Right. And I guess that makes it even harder for that decision, because if you've got two people that don't really, they're not going to tell the truth all the time. They're living wrong anyways to start with. That, how are you going to get the right answer from each one? And obviously you can see where they came. One of them, she knows it. She's rolled over her son at night, killed him, whatever. Woke up, found out what had happened, swapped the kids. She's guilty, and she's going to concoct a story. Then, the assumption would be, well, the other one concocted a story too, that, my child was the one that died. I woke up and then, it wasn't my child. That was my child over there. She took the child from me. It's how, both of them got these, two different stories. And, the fact that either one of them could be lying about it because they're unscrupulous. They would be willing just to go ahead and tell a tall tale, either one, to get the end result of having their child back, whether it was their child or not. And I think, like Chad alluded to, that's even more of the fact that, Solomon takes a situation. He still finds the truth very quickly. Just the thread of the sword cutting the kid in half. Very quickly you find out the real mother says, no, don't do that. I'd rather her have it than the child to die. And then what was the other answer? Go ahead and cut him in half. I don't care. That kind of shows you right off that, the case of, of that lie that she tried to present to start with, to prove that this was actually my child that was still living, even though it was not. So, it's definitely, like I say, it's one of those things that, had that decision ever been made, had we not been able to read about it, it'd be much more so, astounding of a decision that you were able to discern the true truth between these two harlots that were, jawing back and forth about, what really happened or what not, he said, she said type thing. And, obviously once that happened, the word got out, I'm sure, didn't it? The righteous judgment he made, the things that he had asked for. And then I can imagine this is only the start of many, many type situations where he's able to judge and discern the truth from what was going on. Because, the wisdom, it was from God. And he was able to bring the justice.
Jason, just quick, it's interesting, first of all, that Solomon's hearing this case. I mean, this kind of reminds me of Moses in a way, hearing here's the king, the great king, hearing a case like this, rather than deputizing somebody else to do this.
Right.
And the fact that these were harlots to begin with says something for the king, that he's willing, he could just have been dismissed and said, don't bother me, but, these kinds of people are this kind of detail. And, the solution to it is kind of interesting to think how we would handle such. You had to be the king to ask for a sword, right? And somebody take him seriously, that he could have this child cut in half,
Yeah, what do you think?
Most people couldn't, with any validity, propose that kind of a solution.
Right, and what do you think the sword bearer thought at that point? He's like, wow, this is going to be interesting. He's going to cut this child in half. And you had to think too, there were obviously other people around to witness this transaction, and thinking, well, what kind of solution is that? Well, if you cut the child in half, then nobody gets the child, and because the child's obviously going to die. Why is that a wise decision? But obviously the truth came out very quickly, and the fact that he didn't have to cut the child. Do you think he knew that he was not going to have to cut the child in half? Probably so. He used that as an example of how to get to the truth, how to get to the truth of the matter. All right, so let's turn over to the applications on page 92. We're just about out of time, so we probably won't get to the questions, so y'all are going to get off on that. But number one, Solomon is described as the one who loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burns incense at the high places, which we've already discussed. The statement is important for it reminds us that love demands obedience, and making a similar point, the Apostle John wrote, "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome." The description of Solomon also shows that those who love the Lord can be guilty of doing things that are not pleasing to God. God did not want his people worshiping at pagan altars. This is true of Solomon's day, and it remains true today. We must obey the Lord in all things. And obviously, there are going to be times that we mess up, that we do things that are not pleasing to God, but that's the thing, we have forgiveness. We can strive to do what we're called to do as Christians all the time. And then number two, Solomon's desire to properly lead God's people led him to ask for wisdom. God was willing to grant this request and provide Solomon with more than he asked. God remains willing to provide wisdom to his people when they ask. And James wrote, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." So again, that's something we can always strive toward as being wise. And obviously with age, you live different things, you see different experiences, and it kind of molds and shapes you where typically you become wiser as you get older. When I first started working, I'd jump to conclusions real quick. I'd jump on somebody real quick and not get the whole story. Now I'm much more laid back now to say, hey, before we just jump to a decision about what happened, let's get the whole story. Let's find out what's going on. How can we work toward this to work better, to get along with each other when it comes to things like the work? As Christians, we can do the same thing. We can look for that wisdom. We can look for those opportunities to, hey, let's just all take a deep breath, let's step back from the situation, let's diffuse the situation, and now let's figure out what happened or what we can do different in the future so we can get along better, so we can work together better. So like I said, that's something we can always strive for. All right. Any other thoughts or comments? All right. Well, I appreciate everybody's attention, and like I say, next week we'll look at more of Solomon building the temple and the scope of all that.